is my privilege to address the gathering on the theme which you have selected, Educators Laying a Foundation That Will Last. The theme acknowledges that there are many partners engaged in the business of education. In a way, we are all educators. However, the role of the teacher is unquestionably the most important one. The success of the education process for the individual and for the overall system depends on how well each one of these partners, parents, students, teachers, Parent-Teachers Association, education administrators, policymakers, and the public, how each one of these plays their respective roles. In order to be effective, education has to be a collaborative process. The theme also acknowledges and wishes us to focus this evening on the fact that unless the foundation is well and truly laid for education and for life, it is a waste of time. Our Lord Jesus, the greatest teacher who ever lived, told a memorable story about two builders, one who built his house on the rock and the other on the sand. Regarding the house built on the sand, Jesus said, and I quote, "The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." End of quote. That story, as told by Jesus, demonstrates the folly and the futility of building on a foundation that will not last. We often try as adults to motivate young people by reminding them that they are young only once. We warn them that opportunities lost can never be regained. There is also a warning for educators. If you fail to instill into the minds of the young principles of lasting values, if you fail to imbue them with sound character, then you have missed the opportunity of a lifetime. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, said it well when he said, "To educate a person in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to society." End of quote. When I reflect on some of the happenings, I wonder if, perchance, we have been educating, producing, if you will, menaces to our society. Educators have to get it right the first time. They do not have the option open to the manufacturers of luxury cars and even Rolls-Royce engines of recalling their products even years later to correct some flaw. A child miseducated is a child lost. John F. Kennedy. The history of education in St. Kitts is instructive. In 1833, when the British government passed the Emancipation Act to free the slaves, it undertook to make a grant called the Negro Education Grant for the education of the newly emancipated people. The funds were given to religious bodies of the day, the Anglicans, Methodists, and Moravians. The ministers were responsible for running the schools, which were held initially in churches and later in school buildings erected by the churches. In those days, government did not regard education as part of its function or responsibility. They appointed inspectors whose duty it was to ensure that the money provided by the government was being used for the purposes intended. The ministers of the respective churches selected the teachers, and I submit that the criteria were probably based more on qualities, personal qualities, than on educational qualifications. The curriculum was narrow, based as it was on the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. However, some education theorists contend that the curriculum was really based on 4 R's, not 3, because both in terms of its content and its methodology, colonial education incorporated and perhaps even emphasized the 4th R, namely religion. Not only was moral instruction taught within the classroom, but students also attended weekly church services and had occasional visits to their schools from their priests and pastors. The object of religious instruction was to inculcate, quote, duty and reverence, according to Professor Whitehead. The Duke of Wellington probably summed up the philosophy of his age when he said, "Educate men without religion, and you make them but clever devils," end of quote. Notwithstanding the limitation of the education system administered by the religious denominations, its objective was to build academic performance on a foundation of religious and moral principles. A big change came about in 1915 when the religious denominations were faced with a financial crisis due to the fact that some of the educational subventions which normally came from Europe would no longer be forthcoming following the outbreak of the 1914-1918 war. The Anglicans, Methodists, and Moravians handed over the control of the finances and administration of their schools to the government. However, the Roman Catholics decided to retain full responsibility and control for their 2 schools, namely the Convent High School, as it then was, and the St. Joseph's Parochial School. The government closed down many of the schools which it took over. In some parishes, 2 or more schools were merged into one. In the parish of St. George, Basseterre, for example, the Anglican school became the girls' school, and the Methodist school became the boys' school. Following the takeover of the schools by the government, the influence of the churches over education slowly diminished. The teaching of moral instruction and the emphasis on character building as a function of the school soon became things of the past.